At 5:45 p.m. ET today, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran in an attempted surprise attack on U.S. forces based in the Middle East. That's a direct line from U.S. Central Command about the July 28th attack, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about the tension at the center of this story. The pause in fighting did not remove the military threat, and the response unfolded across a network stretching from Iran into Iraq and across the Gulf. Today, we're breaking down what actually happened to Iran's Iraq weapons network, and why the answer is more complicated than the title suggests, using only what CENTCOM, Reuters, AP, and regional reporting have actually confirmed. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the United States and Saudi Arabia focused on Iran-aligned sites in Iraq, why Baghdad immediately ordered an investigation into the alleged drone launches, why Iran's own media and affiliated groups rejected parts of the accusation, and why I think the real strategic objective was not simply to destroy a weapons network, which I'm going to walk you through at the very end. There's a lot of loud talk online about Iran's entire regional weapons network being destroyed, and that does not match what independent reporting and Iran-linked sources are actually saying. So let's get into it, sourced, step by step. The first thing you need to understand is the geography. Iraq sits between Iran and the Arab Gulf states. That makes it strategically important, but it also makes it politically complicated. Iran-backed armed groups operate inside Iraq, while Baghdad officially maintains its own security forces and government institutions. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, depends heavily on energy infrastructure in its eastern province. So when Riyadh says drones were launched from Iraqi territory toward Saudi energy facilities, the accusation immediately becomes bigger than one drone attack. It becomes a question about whether Iraqi territory is being used as a launch platform in a wider regional confrontation. On July 28th, Saudi Arabia said its air defenses intercepted multiple drones targeting oil facilities in the kingdom's eastern province. Saudi military spokesman Turki al-Malki said the drones originated from Iraqi territory and were launched by Iran-backed militias. Saudi Arabia also said it reserved the right to respond at a time and place of its choosing. But Baghdad did not simply accept that accusation as established fact. Iraq's government ordered an investigation into the Saudi claim. The Iraqi government said its security authorities would examine whether drones targeting Saudi Arabia had actually been launched from Iraqi territory. That distinction matters. An allegation is not the same thing as an independently established fact. Look at the map for a second. You can see why Iraq becomes the critical middle ground here. Iran is immediately to the east. Saudi Arabia is to the south. U.S. forces operate across the region, and Iraq contains armed factions with varying degrees of connection to Tehran. That creates a strategic environment where responsibility can become deliberately difficult to establish. Now add the United States. According to AP, the U.S. military intercepted multiple ballistic missiles launched by Iran toward American forces in the Middle East. CENTCOM described the launch as an attempted surprise attack. The missiles were successfully intercepted, according to the U.S. military. The timing was significant because the United States had paused its direct strike campaign against Iran. President Donald Trump had publicly expressed optimism about talks with Tehran, but he also warned that U.S. strikes could resume if diplomacy failed. Reuters reported that Trump described the talks as positive, while Iran publicly rejected the idea that direct negotiations were taking place. That created an extraordinary contradiction. Diplomacy was supposedly moving forward, but military activity was continuing around the edges, and the Iraq question was becoming part of that pressure. The immediate sequence was therefore not simply U.S. versus Iran. It was a chain. Iran launched ballistic missiles toward U.S. forces, according to CENTCOM. Saudi Arabia reported drone attacks from Iraqi territory. Baghdad opened an investigation. The United States and Saudi Arabia then carried out coordinated precision strikes against sites belonging to Iran-backed groups in Iraq, according to Reuters and AP reporting. According to Reuters, the United States military said the strikes targeted sites belonging to groups aligned with Iran. The groups were described as being directed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. AP reported that the strikes came after more than 30 drone attacks allegedly directed by Iran's Revolutionary Guard. But there is an important point here. The reporting does not establish that every weapon facility connected to Iran's regional network was destroyed. It does not establish that Iran's entire weapons infrastructure inside Iraq was eliminated. And it does not establish that the network itself ceased to exist. What it does establish is narrower. U.S. and Saudi forces struck specific sites associated with Iran-backed groups. Those strikes came amid a wider series of attacks involving Iranian missiles, drones, and regional armed factions. And that is where the title becomes interesting. Because the question is not whether something happened to Iran's Iraq weapons network. Something clearly did. The question is how much of that network was actually affected, and whether the strikes were designed to destroy the network or to change its behavior. Before we go further, consider the numbers. Reuters reported that oil prices fell by roughly 5% on July 28th as markets reacted to the pause in direct U.S. Iran hostilities. Brent crude reached about $84, 109 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate fell to approximately $79. 26. The Strait of Hormuz normally handles roughly 20% of global oil flows. That means this conflict is not confined to military bases. It is connected to one of the world's most important energy corridors. And every drone launched from Iraq, every missile fired from Iran, and every vessel threatened near the Gulf can influence calculations far beyond the battlefield. The same day, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi spoke separately with Saudi and Omani officials about the security of the Strait of Hormuz. That diplomatic activity is important because it shows the conflict was moving simultaneously on two tracks. One track involved missiles and drones, the other involved diplomacy and maritime security. Now look at what happened inside Iraq. The Iraqi government was placed in an extremely difficult position. Saudi Arabia accused Iran-backed militias operating from Iraq of launching attacks against Saudi infrastructure. The Iraqi government ordered an investigation, and an umbrella group known as the Islamic Resistance in Iraq rejected the accusation. According to AFP reporting carried by regional outlets, the group described the Saudi accusations as fabrications intended to justify Riyadh's response to attacks from Yemen. That is the adversary side narrative you need to hear. The group did not accept Saudi Arabia's version of events. It argued that the accusations were politically motivated. So you have three competing positions. Saudi Arabia says drones came from Iraqi territory. Iraq says the allegation must be investigated. And the Iran-aligned militia network denies responsibility. That disagreement is not a minor detail. It is the core problem. Because if the United States and Saudi Arabia believe the Iraqi territory is being used to launch attacks, they have an incentive to strike the infrastructure supporting those launches. But if Baghdad cannot fully control the armed groups operating inside its borders, then every strike risks creating a political crisis between Iraq and its neighbors. Well, watch the tail number here. This is where the military story becomes a political story. The weapons used in these attacks matter, but so does the question of who controls the territory from which they are launched. A missile or drone does not need to carry an Iranian flag to create a strategic problem for Iran. It only needs to be linked convincingly enough to the network supporting it. That is why the strikes in Iraq matter even if they did not eliminate the entire network. They were aimed at the machinery surrounding the threat, the logistics, the weapons storage, the operational infrastructure, and the ability to launch attacks from Iraqi territory. According to Reuters, the U.S. military said the strikes were coordinated with Saudi Arabia. That coordination itself is significant. Saudi Arabia has spent years trying to strengthen its security relationship with Washington while also maintaining diplomatic channels with Tehran. Now it was participating in military action against Iran-aligned groups in Iraq. That is a very different regional equation from a purely American operation, and it tells you something about the scale of the perceived threat. The strikes were not happening in isolation. They were part of a regional security chain involving Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the Strait of Hormuz. If you want the real story instead of whatever exaggerated headline is trending this week, subscribe and turn on notifications because I'm going to keep tracking this one specifically. The next update might be the one where the fragile pause in fighting actually breaks. Now let's step back and look at the machinery behind all of this. Iran has several ways to pressure the United States without directly engaging American forces in a conventional war. It can use ballistic missiles, it can use drones, it can rely on regional armed groups, and it can exploit geography. The Strait of Hormuz is the obvious example. The waterway is narrow. The surrounding region contains major energy infrastructure, and any disruption can affect global markets. But the same logic applies to Iraq. Iraq provides strategic depth. It borders Iran. It contains important transportation routes. And it has armed factions that operate outside the conventional structure of the Iraqi state. That makes it useful for pressure. But it also creates vulnerabilities. If an armed group launches an attack from Iraqi territory, Baghdad can be pressured by Saudi Arabia. The United States can justify defensive action. And Iran can deny direct responsibility. That is the machinery. It is a system built around ambiguity. The United States has its own constraints. Washington wants to protect its forces. It wants to protect regional partners. It wants to keep shipping routes open. But it also has to manage the cost of sustained military operations. Air defense interceptors are expensive. Strike aircraft require maintenance. Long-range weapons require replenishment. And political pressure rises when a conflict appears to have no clear endpoint. The Iranian side faces constraints too. Its missile inventory is not unlimited. Its regional networks are exposed. Its economy is under pressure. And every direct attack against U.S. forces creates the possibility of a much larger American response. So both sides have reasons to apply pressure without crossing certain thresholds. That is why the Iraq weapons network becomes important. The United States does not necessarily need to destroy every weapon. It may only need to convince the network that launching those weapons carries a rising cost. Saudi Arabia may not need to eliminate every drone. It may need to make the launch infrastructure less reliable. And Iran may not need to win a conventional battle. It may only need to preserve enough capability to remain dangerous. There's one read of all this that I think is the correct one, and it is not the obvious one. But I'm not going to hand it to you yet, because there are two more things you need to see first. And they're the two things that changed my mind. Quick gut check. Drop a comment right now with just the single word pressure if you think the strikes were mainly designed to force Iran and its proxies to change behavior, or escalation if you think they are pushing the region toward a wider war. I genuinely want to see where this audience lands before I give you my own read at the end of this video. Now, let's take one specific case. The most important concrete incident is the reported attack sequence involving Saudi energy infrastructure and Iraqi territory. According to Saudi officials, drones were launched from Iraq toward oil facilities in the kingdom's eastern province. Saudi air defenses intercepted the drones. The attack did not produce the strategic outcome the attackers presumably wanted, but the allegation itself immediately changed the military equation. Saudi Arabia could now point toward Iraqi territory as part of the threat. Baghdad had to respond politically, and Washington had another reason to coordinate with Riyadh. The United States and Saudi Arabia then struck sites belonging to Iran-aligned groups in Iraq, according to Reuters and AP. The targets were described as sites associated with militant groups aligned with Iran. The U.S. military said those groups had been directed by the IRGC. This is where the title's phrase, Iraq Weapons Network, becomes useful, but only if you understand what it does not mean. It does not mean every Iranian weapon in Iraq was destroyed. It does not mean every militia facility was eliminated. It does not mean Iran lost the ability to operate through regional partners. What it means is that a specific portion of the network was directly targeted. The purpose was to impose a cost on the infrastructure that enables attacks. That is the first of the two things I mentioned. Forget the maps for 90 seconds. You're a night shift worker near a busy industrial area in eastern Iraq. It's late, and the air around you is still. You can see lights in the distance. You hear the normal sounds of machinery and vehicles moving through the night. Then the rhythm changes. There's a distant flash. A few seconds later, you hear a deep impact rolling across the air. You stop what you're doing. You look toward the horizon. You do not know exactly what was hit. You do not know who launched the strike. You only know that something has changed. You move away from the open area. You check the people around you. You wait. Another sound follows. Then silence returns. You listen again. You watch the sky. You wait for information that may not come immediately. And when the phones begin filling with messages, you realize the event you just heard is part of something much larger. That's the layer underneath every number I just gave you. And it's the second thing that changed how I read this. I want to be clear that this next part is my opinion, not reported fact. My non-obvious read is that the most important result of the strikes may not be the physical damage at all. It may be the attempt to redraw the cost of using Iraq as a launch platform. Run it forward. If Iran-aligned groups continue launching attacks from Iraqi territory, then Saudi Arabia faces pressure to respond. If Saudi Arabia responds directly, then Baghdad faces a sovereignty crisis. If Baghdad cannot control the groups involved, then the United States has a stronger argument for striking the infrastructure supporting those attacks. And suddenly, the network that was useful because it operated in the gray zone becomes less useful, precisely because the gray zone is disappearing. That is the strategic calculation I think is hiding underneath the headlines. The United States may not need to destroy the entire network. It may only need to make the network less effective as a tool of deniable pressure. The read that beats mine is that these strikes are simply another step toward a much larger regional war. Here's why I don't buy it as the most likely explanation right now. Every major actor still has incentives to preserve some room for diplomacy. Trump was publicly talking about negotiations. Iranian officials were engaging regional governments over maritime security. Saudi Arabia was defending itself while still operating within a broader diplomatic environment. And Iraq was investigating the allegations, rather than immediately entering the conflict as a direct combatant. That does not guarantee de-escalation. But it suggests that the current strategy is still about managing escalation, rather than surrendering control of it. If you want deep dives like this the moment new information actually gets confirmed, share this with one person who's been confused by the louder, less careful takes floating around. So let's bring everything together. First, CENTCOM said IRGC forces launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran in what it called an attempted surprise attack against U.S. forces in the Middle East. Second, according to the U.S. military, all of those Iranian missiles were successfully intercepted. Third, Saudi Arabia said drones targeting its energy infrastructure had been launched from Iraqi territory by Iran-backed militias, while Baghdad ordered an investigation and Iran-aligned groups rejected the accusation. Fourth, Reuters and AP reported that U.S. and Saudi forces carried out coordinated precision strikes against sites associated with Iran-backed groups in Iraq. Fifth, the wider conflict remained connected to the Strait of Hormuz, where shipping and energy markets were still being affected by the confrontation. Now, let's resolve the title honestly. You won't believe what just happened to Iran's Iraq weapons network. What happened is that a portion of the infrastructure associated with Iran-aligned armed groups in Iraq was targeted by coordinated U.S. and Saudi strikes. What was not confirmed is that Iran's entire Iraq weapons network was destroyed. There's no evidence that the entire network disappeared overnight. There's no evidence that every weapons depot, launch capability, or militia facility connected to Iran was eliminated. The more defensible conclusion is that the network was hit, exposed, and placed under greater pressure, and that may actually be more strategically important than a claim of total destruction. Because the real contest is not simply about how many buildings were damaged. It is about whether the network can continue operating with the same freedom it had before. If the strikes force Iran-aligned groups to relocate, if they force them to hide their logistics, if they make launches harder to coordinate, and if they increase the political cost of using Iraqi territory, then the network may become less effective even while remaining intact. That brings us back to your one-word comment. Pressure or escalation? Did the debrief change your answer? Because my read is that this was primarily about pressure. Not because the threat disappeared. It clearly did not. But because the United States and its partners appeared to be trying to raise the cost of the network's operations without necessarily committing themselves to destroying every part of it. And that distinction may determine what happens next.